I'm very glad to accommodate the masses in my class. That shows that there's huge interest in theoretical economics, which is all that you will ever get from me at the summer university. At least this year, because the year before where I had some history class. Our subject is equilibrium economics, and what I will do in this lecture is to explain the nature of equilibrium, the nature of equilibrium economics, or equilibrium analysis, and the significance of equilibrium for human action and economic science. And I hope you will see at the end that the whole issue is fundamental for understanding not only economics, or at least understanding a very important central problem of economic science, namely the problem of the relation between theory and the real world. So what's the precise relationship between economic theory and the real world that this economic theory describes? And of course we've got to start with a little definition. Definition not in the sense of the positivists, it's a convention about how we use words. Well, certainly a convention about how we use words, but it's not only this, it's a description of the phenomenon that we will talk about. And the phenomenon that is at the center of equilibrium economics is error. Right. For equilibrium is defined as the absence of error. Right. In all human action, so one of the characteristic features of human action is that we do make choices. In choices we are always confronted with alternatives, we prefer one thing over another. Now the point is that the choice alternatives are not equally important. There's only one of them that we can perform, right, and other things that we cannot do. And by the very fact that we do one thing rather than another thing, we demonstrate that we believe that this alternative that we do choose is more important to us than the alternatives that we do not choose. Right? Now, error comes into play because what we believe about the importance of our choice alternatives does not necessarily correspond to reality. Right? So you might choose to hang out at the bar, right? Thinking, well, so this is the most important choice under given circumstances. A la Auburn, Alabama, you have a hard day of study behind you and so on. Now you head out for the bar. And rather than to the bed, and the next morning, there's been the confrontation between your beliefs about reality and the hard reality. Right? Now, it doesn't always mean that going to the bar and then jumping to the binge, that was an error, it was a wrong decision, but it could have been. Right? One wrong illustration of Austrian business cycle theory to present it as kind of a hangover theory. You might have heard about this. Right? So that's Paul Krugman's, the genius, characterization of Austrian business cycle theory. He said, oh, it's kind of a moralizing and this hangover thing, right? You shouldn't drink so much and then wake up the next morning with a head and so on. Well, so that's not at all what Austrian business cycle theory is about. Right? And that's not even error in the economic sense. If you go to the bar, right, start a period of intensive study of alcohol, knowing full well how you will feel next morning, right? And then full knowledge or full anticipation of the fact, correct anticipation of the fact, prefer to do this rather than something else, well, there's no error involved here. Right? You knew what was going to happen the next morning, right? So to say, part of the whole picture that you do not like, but you cannot choose only the good sides of this alternative. You've got to choose a bundle, right? You choose on the one hand the bundle going to bed, having no alcohol, waking up the next morning without a big head, or going to the bar, having lots of fun, waking up the morning with a big head. That's the bundle alternatives that you have. And if you choose the first one, or in this case the second one, knowing what will happen, well, there's no error involved. Okay? And so similarly, therefore, that cannot be the problem at stake in business cycle theory. The problem in business cycle theory is rather the person who goes to the bar, has never had any acquaintance with alcoholic beverage, right? And then finds out the next morning, oh my goodness, what's going on, right? Everything is turning, and he sees the stars, and doesn't like this, right? So there's a confrontation between his belief and reality that show the wrong-headedness of his anticipations. Okay, so in any human action, therefore, we have a dichotomy between success and error. Our actions can be either successful or they can be erroneous. They are successful if we choose the most important out of the available alternatives. They are erroneous if we do not choose the most important of the available alternatives. Why? Whereas the error in the economic sense, not in a technological sense. The error is precisely in choosing one alternative that prevents me from doing what would really have been more important. Right? The person who does not anticipate the effect of alcohol on his brain, he chooses an alternative, namely drinking, that is less important than another action that would have been more important for him, but prevents the execution of this erroneous action, prevents the other action. So herein lies the error. Where's the difference with technological error? Well, in technological error we have wrong ideas about means and ends, right? We have a means. Okay, so that's technological. That is economic error. For example, building a bridge for trucks and cars and so on out of chocolate. Right? We built this whole thing, and then it looks beautiful and smells great. It's Belgian chocolate. We've taken great care. Have only the finest ingredients. Then the first truck comes and the whole thing smashes. So in this case, that's a technological error, right? Because we did not choose a means that is fit to attain the end. Right? Economic error, in some sense, is a special type of technological error. Right? If we define our end as achieving the most important goals in our life, the most important economic goals in our life, well, then choosing less important alternatives than those that we could have done would also be technological error, so to say, in this sense. Right? But in the case of technological error more narrowly, the problem that we have is that the means is objectively not suitable to bring about a certain physical event that we planned. Right? So the bridge does not objectively allow, the chocolate bridge does not objectively allow us to have trucks and cars and so on drive over it. Whereas if we go to the bar and drink, whereas we should better have stayed at home, well, we still produce a certain effect, right? We have fun and we get drunk and so on. Right? So certainly there's no failure in this narrow technological sense. Now, error is an individual concept, right? Because it's a characteristic of human choice. It is a potential feature of human choice, just as success is a potential feature of human choice. And so we can meaningfully speak of an individual acting person acting in equilibrium and also acting in disequilibrium, that is, making wrong choices, committing errors, choosing less important actions than he could have chosen. An equilibrium, in this sense, is a dynamic reality. Right? It's a dynamic phenomenon. It's not a state of affairs. Right? Time goes on. In the course of time, conditions change constantly. Right? As we proceed during the day, the weather, the temperature moves up. We become ever more awake. Right? So conditions do not stay the same. So there's a rhythm of the day. There's a rhythm of the season. these are rhythms, but then there are also things that bring about changes without any recurrent or regular feature, right? Just think of the fact that we are acting under circumstances here in the year 2003 in the United States. Certain technological conditions, we use computers, we have cars of a certain technological endowment and so on, that did not exist at other points of time. Right? Population, as our fellow market participants, are endowed with ethnic and racial heritage and genetic heritage that did not exist at other points of time. Right? So all these are unique conditions in a way, constantly change. But all this does not affect the categories of error and success. Whatever the conditions are, right, we can act successfully in the sense that we choose the most important out of the available alternatives. Right? So equilibrium, right, is a phenomenon in time. It denotes a process, not a state of affairs. As far as one individual is concerned, we can therefore meaningfully speak of individual equilibrium, individual errors or disequilibrium, but we can also speak of general equilibrium, which has some importance in economic science, insofar as we take into consideration the behavior of many individuals acting together. Now, and it is clear that as long as at least one individual commits an error, there can be no general equilibrium in society. Right? All others might act in equilibrium given the way he behaves. Right? Let's assume, for example, you have somebody who is drinking excessive amounts of alcohol and that's ruining his health. Right? And each morning he regrets and says, "Oh, devil, alcohol, I should have renounced thee," and so on. Right? But he does it again and again and again. Now, okay, what does this imply for his interaction with other individuals? Well, there will be some who make money dealing with him, right? There will be some who produce the alcohol, selling it to him, others who cater for him, servers in the bar and so on. All these people make a living on him. Given his behavior, erroneous though it might be, given his personality, these other people act in equilibrium for themselves because they do choose the most important out of the available alternatives. Okay? But still, we wouldn't speak of general equilibrium in this case. Now, in order to understand the importance of these considerations within the edifice of the system of economic science, we need to bring into play two other elements. One is the distinction between ex post and ex ante, which I will talk in a minute. And the other consideration is the significance of arbitrage. Now, there's a correct way to understand arbitrage, and there's an incorrect way to understand arbitrage. The incorrect way to understand arbitrage departs from the notion that equilibrium connotes a state of affairs, a state, and that human action can bring us closer to the state of affairs, or that it can bring us further away from the state of affairs. Okay? In this case, so arbitrage would be an action that brings us closer to the state of affairs. What the arbitrageur does, say we have two firms. One is buying at 50, selling at 55. And the other firm is buying at 48 and selling at 57. Right? Now let's assume that for each of these entrepreneurs, all that really matters is the monetary side of the affair. So they have no personal preference for doing. So this could be, let's say, this is a shoe factory, right? And this is a candy factory. Right? No obsession with chocolate. I also like candy. So, and what does the arbitrageur do? Well, he sees, okay, this producer reaps a higher return on his investment than this one. So what does he do? Let's say the shoe producer realizes he takes out some of his investment. We don't have to talk about the shoe producer. So we have an additional person coming into play. He goes into the candy production, right? Takes resources out of the shoe production. Let's say he was a shareholder in the shoe factory or a creditor of the shoe producer. Doesn't extend the credit that he has given in the past. Gives the credit rather to the candy maker. Right? So as a consequence, the shoemaker will be less in a position to compete with the candy maker. The candy maker can draw factors of production away from the shoemaker, right, bidding up the prices for the factors of production, and as a consequence, right, let's say he will pay 49, but more candy will be produced, so as a consequence, prices will drop to 56, and here something very similar will happen, right? 49. We spend less on factors of production, and as a consequence, we produce less shoes, as the price of shoes will go up to 56. And you see now the return in both ventures is exactly the same. So we would have a state of general equilibrium. So that is the role of arbitrage, right? Arbitrage, this means in the sense that I have denoted, so it's part of this process that brings about equilibrium, or brings us closer to equilibrium. Now, the problem with this notion is that equilibrium itself is not a state of affairs, as I have explained before. Right? Equilibrium is not something that we do attain only after a few intermediate steps. Rather, equilibrium is a possibility, it's a potential of any present action. Right? Because equilibrium itself is a dynamic process, goes through time. And arbitrage itself, therefore, is ultimately the fact that we choose a more important to a less important action. That is arbitrage. Right. To give you another example, consider the situation that we had before, in which we had here 50 expenditure and 55 return, 48 expenditure here and 57 return. Well, how would we qualify the actions of the shoemaker? Well, we would say, well, he has committed an error, right? He has committed an error, but the candy maker himself. So this was a kind of an arbitrageur. He went into this business, into the candy making business, rather than into the shoemaking business, and as a consequence, brought about reduced this the price spread between cost expenditure and selling proceeds in the candy business. So he is the arbitrageur, right? The second consideration that plays against this static notion of equilibrium arbitrage is that we cannot repeat the conditions of action. Right? In the initial situation here, with the example that I've depicted, somehow simplifies the conditions under which entrepreneurs have typically to act. Right? The problem is that entrepreneurs do not know the future proceeds, and their very action modifies the conditions under which they act. Right? So let's say we had, at the beginning, there was first year there were no shoe factory, no candy factory. Then the shoemaker set up his factory, and the candy maker set up his factory, and he spent 50 and ultimately reaped 45 return. He spent 48 and ultimately reaped 57 return. Now, does this mean that, well, from these facts we can conclude we can just go on like this in the future? No, we cannot. Because this very action itself transforms the condition under which the entrepreneurs have to act. Right? The fact that he has these returns means, higher returns means, well, the income or the total income of the people involved in the candy production is higher than the total income of people involved in the shoe production, which in turn will have repercussions on the profitability of entrepreneurs or of firms in the subsequent periods. Okay? So the market process itself entails or goes in hand with constant redistribution of resources. And these redistributions determine the future profitability of all ventures. So it is not, I mean, again, right, so I say this in order to warn you against endorsing this static notion of equilibration or arbitrage. Right? The point is, it's a dynamic process, and at any point of time, entrepreneurs can be in equilibrium or not. If they act in disequilibrium, that is, they choose the most important, less important action than they could have chosen, right? The shoemaker invests in the shoemaking business rather than in more candy production. Well, usually you cannot make good for this in the future, right? Just changing your condition, or changing your decisions. You find yourself suddenly at some future point of time, and then still the decision is to know, well, what is the most important action under given circumstances? Okay? What would it mean in this case, for example? So if we then approach the whole subject from a dynamic perspective, well, it would mean so we find that we earn here a higher return on candies than on shoes. It means that since there's just one going rate of interest in the economy, that suddenly the value of our factors of production, at least of our immobile factors of production, will be higher in this case. Right? It would be higher in the books, right? 49. Than this year. Okay, everything returns. Okay. Let's say 47. Something like this. Right? You run a business. You expected to make at least earn the same return as you could have made elsewhere, because otherwise you would not have invested in it. Right? You're the shoemaker. Suddenly you find out that your returns are lower in comparison to your proceeds than the relationship between selling proceeds and cost expenditure in other businesses. What this means is that really the value of your assets, of your productive assets, is lower than you anticipated. Right? And that's the way how, from an accounting point of view, this entrepreneurial error is reflected in the books. Right? You have this writing off. Right? That's what entrepreneurs do. They write off. And the result of writing an asset, the value of an asset off, is that you now have a faithful reflection between the value of the asset and the selling proceeds. Now it's the same, right? But the fact that we do write off things shows that we recognize, well, there's no way to make good for this. We cannot draw these real resources out. Right? Here have been reasoning entirely of money proceeds, but the problem is that you have planted your money into a factory and other real assets, right? Cars and machines that are very specific, and you cannot just transform them from one factory into the other, just as you can transform money capital, right? Take it away out of this and put it here. So what does happen is that you write off the value, your monetary evaluation of your assets, and as a consequence of this writing off, there's again equilibrium, right? In the between the different industries. Okay, now the second element, that is ex ante and ex post. Well, these are the remnants of the Latin language of the economist. It doesn't get much better than that. It's about as taught as we get, ex ante, ex post. And what it means, of course, is before and after, before the fact and after the fact. what this distinction alludes to is are the two different points of view that we can, from which we can observe human action or analyze human action. The ex-ante point of view is, well, before we make the decision, or at the moment when we make the decision, put it into practice, and then ex-post, we look at it and say, well, evaluate it in the light of subsequent events. Right? And the significance of this distinction, which has been first emphasized by the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. Does any one of you who know when Myrdal received the Nobel Prize? Same year as Hayek. Yeah, was about as good as Hayek. So Myrdal emphasized this in his youth works. And so the importance of the distinction is that it highlights the difference between the beliefs that we have about reality, about the real world, and the coincidence with these beliefs with the real world. It is in ex-ante analysis, we explain human behavior as resulting from the beliefs that they have about the real world. So that is the principle of subjectivism. We don't care about whether they are right or wrong. We just say, well, they did have these beliefs, and therefore they acted in a certain manner. And then exposed, we bring into play another consideration where we raise the question, well, were these beliefs actually true? Right? Did they correspond to the state of affairs as it existed in the economy? Ex ante, so how does this relate to error and success? Well, ex ante, every single action, from the point of view of the acting person, is the most important one. Right? It is impossible to err ex ante from the subjective point of view. Right? Remember what Professor Hoppe said in another lecture. He said, well, one of the examples of a priori facts is, well, you cannot intentionally choose to err something. Right? If I'm confronted between the alternative of going to the bar or going to bed, knowing full well what the results will be when I go to the bar, and say, okay, now that's a very bad outcome, but I do want to do this, right? In order to disprove the Austrians. Well, I would not disprove the Austrians. I would only show, well, that for me the whole bundle, going to the bar, getting drunk, having a big head the next day, and disproving the Austrians is more important, right, than staying at home, going to bed. Well, but then I would not have, in fact, acted erroneously, but very well acted according to my intentions and brought about the result according to my intentions, except that I didn't disprove the Austrians. So, and exposed then, so error shows up only exposed. Now there's this nuance here, right? So we have to say, from the subjective point of view, there is no error. No error. Error is impossible. From the objective point of view, error is committed at the very moment when I make an erroneous choice, right? So there is an error. And exposed then, of course, objectively, the error is still manifest. But exposed then even subjectively, that is, even the actor himself, he who committed the error, finds out that he has erred. So this whole analysis of error and so is somewhat peculiar to Austrian economics. It plays a role already in Karl Menger's Principles of Economics. In one of the first chapters you will find a section that with the title Time Error. Right? And what Menger alludes to is precisely this subjective dimension, right? Time and error. Error shows up from the point of view of the acting individual only in the course of time. Right? Objectively, error comes into being right at the moment when I make my choice, even though I myself do not believe that I made an error. Okay. So ex ante economics the distinction is important because it allows us also to highlight the fact that many theorems of economics do not depend at all on exposed considerations. Right? Many things that we can infer from the mere fact that human beings do choose what they believe are the most important actions at any point of time. In particular, we can explain the market process. Right? So we have here a market, little schema of the market process. We have the consumers. Right? And there we have different firms. And even more firms, right, the structure of production. So that's a kind of a time X of production. And then we have all these different expenditures, right? So this consumer spent his money here on these goods, and this guy on these goods, and here so, right? So you get the point. And these two guys, and so, right? This one has only consumes only one good, hamburgers, and right, and then goes on. Right. Something like this. So what happens here in this process is that consumers make decisions as to how to spend their money, on which products to spend their money, and these expenditures are the selling proceeds of the entrepreneurs. The success of entrepreneurs, the profitability of each venture, ultimately depends on how much money consumers will spend on their products, right? And in the light of what they expect consumers to spend on their products, these entrepreneurs go onto the factor markets and there compete for factors of production. Right? No entrepreneur pays more in total on factors of production, more as compared to what would still make his firm profitable. Right? So let's say he assumes that you will get selling proceeds of 110 in the future, well, and he wants to make at least a return of 10%, then he will not spend more than 100, whatever, ounces of gold on factors of production. Right? And with this intention in mind, he appears on the factor markets, and there his valuation of the factors of production, spending not more than 100. For example, let's consider this entrepreneur here will spend a total of 100 on these three factors of production. He will enter business only if he can do this. If he cannot do it, well, he will just not produce. He will choose not to produce. He will go out of business. So, of course, he will try to buy the factors of production at a low price as possible, but he cannot do this because other entrepreneurs want to buy them too. So, thus we have a market process that we can explain without reference to the question in how far the beliefs of the market participants were in fact correct. Right? What comes into being, the firms that come into existence and so on, result only from the ex-ante speculations of the market participants. Right? And all other things, the allocation of capital in time and space, the distribution of income, and all of this results only from the ex-ante beliefs of the market participants. Okay? And of course, this is highly important from a political point of view because it highlights the fact that the market economy is a process that caters to the needs of private property owners. Right? It caters to the needs of those, or the needs as estimated in the light of entrepreneurial speculation, to the needs of those who will spend their income or their wealth on products. Right? The market process is not dissociated from consumer needs. Right? Its very meaning is to cater to these needs and to select all the use of any specific factor of production in the light of these supposed needs of consumers. Right? Now, before I come to the exposed point of view, let me also point out then, of course, that is also empirically, it's descriptive of what entrepreneurs do. Right? If you ask an entrepreneur, well, why do you invest in this line of production? He will tell you, well, it's not because I don't care about what other people will do with my product. Right? That's not the answer that you will get. He will tell you precisely, well, that's because I think that doing this, what I do, I can earn more money than I could earn elsewhere in any other venture. Therefore, he does what he does. Right? So it is not just an intellectual construction. It reflects very faithfully the attitude that the individual market participants bring toward their activities. Okay. Now, how does the exposed point of view enter the picture? As I've said, exposed, the individual discovers any errors that he has committed in the past. How do these errors show up from an economic point of view? Well, most notably, in the form of a specific income component. Namely, in the form of profit and loss. Profit and loss is one income component next to a few others. Traditionally, here we distinguish interest, or let's say rents, interest and wages, which are also rents ultimately. The point is that interest on capital would be paid, and wages for laborers would be paid even in general equilibrium. Right? Whereas profit and loss disappear. That's the big difference. The characteristic feature of profit and loss of this income component is that it disappears to the extent that market participants do not commit errors. Whereas the other income components subsist. Right? They exist both in equilibrium and in disequilibrium situations. Whereas profit and loss exist only in disequilibrium situations. What is a profit? A profit is that part of your income that could have been arbitraged away. Right? So think of our two firms above, the shoemaker has a return of 10% and the candy maker has a higher return. That part of the income of the candy maker that would have disappeared had capital not been invested in the shoemaking business but rather in the candy making business, right? That part of his income is profit. That's the shoemaker's profit, the candy maker's profit. Okay. The shoemaker, he earned a lower return on his investment than he would have earned in general equilibrium. That is, if he himself had not committed an error. That is, his loss is the income component. Is that part of his income that represents the difference between his present income and the income he would have attained in general equilibrium. Had he not himself committed an error, he would not have incurred a loss. So again, profit and loss spring from erroneous entrepreneurial actions. Loss springs from errors of the entrepreneur himself. So loss is always your own fault. Right? Profit springs from the errors of other market participants, of other entrepreneurs. As an entrepreneur, you make a profit if other entrepreneurs were not smart enough to do something that was sufficiently similar to what you are doing, thus reducing your price spread. Now that too is highly politically significant, right? Because it shows us, well, profit is not something, well, it's because you have somehow been a jackass or whatever, right? Dealing some bad blow to somebody else, doing something bad. That's not because you make a profit. You make a profit because without you, consumers would be even more deprived, right, of the things that they need. You make a profit because other entrepreneurs were jackasses, because they did not care enough or did not sufficiently anticipate what were the true needs of consumers. Only you were good enough to do this, you couldn't fully cater for their needs, but in any case more than anybody else did. That's why you make a profit. Okay, so these then are categories of economic analysis, or categories of human action, in fact. And I've highlighted their political significance. Now, if we want to apply them in concrete empirical analysis of any firm or of any market situations, the whole thing becomes very messy. And the reason is that we can properly identify profit and loss only if we can solve two problems. First of all, we've got to solve the problem of identifying the preference scales for each individual market participant. Let me return to our initial example. So we have the two firms, our shoe producer and our candy maker. Oh, wait a minute. 57, 48. So here I blithely assumed that the difference in the returns that they make on their investments, well, that this represented some error. The point is that is not necessarily the case. Now let's assume, well, here we have something, let's say that's a steel mill, steel. And here we have, well, what's a nice thing to do? What do many people like to do? Well, we have a clothing shop, let's say, right? Clothing. Oh, it's the other way around, sorry. That is the steel mill, and that is the clothing shop. That is steel, and that is clothing. So what we observe are the money entries. We can observe that the clothing shop can be a retail business or whatever, has selling proceeds of 55, spends 50 on factors of production. We also do observe that the steel mill has selling proceeds of 57, spends 48 on factors of production. Now the question is this a situation, is this a disequilibrium situation? And the point is, not necessarily. Right? Because, according to our assumption, it's nicer to work in the clothing business, right? That's a much more agreeable environment, right? You have all these, say you have a male entrepreneur, right? You have all these females around him doing the selling and so on. It's nice and friendly atmosphere. He doesn't realize all the bitching that is going on, right? Because, right? Whereas in the steel factory, you have all these guys, and the steel workers are not exactly charming. The union bosses, and it's a terrible mess. And so I said, okay, in order to compensate me for this, right, I won't even start doing this, right, dealing with all these terrible people. Well, there must be something more than what I could earn elsewhere. Otherwise, I would not even enter the whole business, right? So what comes into play then here are the subjective preferences of individual entrepreneurs, right? And given these preferences, it is very well possible that this is an equilibrium situation, right? It would not be an improvement from the point of view of the entrepreneur doing the clothing business to go into the steel business. Oh no, right? It's not worth the while. So it would not be an improvement. He did not make a wrong decision from his point of view. And for the steel maker, well, same thing. It would not be, from the point of view of the steel maker, he could not work at a lower return either. Okay, so there's one problem. The other problem is identifying the available alternatives. Right? As why do are agricultural products, are they expensive or cheap in the United States? or in Europe. Let's say in Europe. Europe, the example is even clearer. Very expensive. So why are they so expensive? Yeah, it's subsidies, but it's especially that there's no foreign competition. Right? So, what we observe then, let's say, here in this case, probably in order to get more realistic figures, we'd have to say something like this. I have to say, 50 and, let's say, 60, 30, and 60. So let's assume that is an agricultural firm in Europe, invests 50 ounces of gold on factors of production, reap selling proceeds of 60. And that is a third world agricultural firm, a third world farmer, and probably the figures are even an understatement, right? He spends 30 on factors of production and could reap selling proceeds of 60 on a free market. The problem is, under our present regime, this alternative is simply not available. And consumers in Europe cannot rely on cooperating with farmers in Sudan or Cameroon or wherever else in Africa, where you could produce the same stuff that we consume at a much lower cost. Okay, so it follows, therefore, that under given circumstances,